This is the math of war, and today's lesson concerns the concept of swaps, in particular what we'll call a loss swap. A loss swap occurs when an adversarial event causes both sides to lose an equivalent amount of fighting power. Let's quickly examine this definition just a little bit before we move forward. The term adversarial event sounds very broad and kind of dry, but let's go with that for now to encompass the many different types of contest that can occur. Such a term encompasses a battle, a siege, a blockade, and other overtly warlike events, but it also can include other kinds of struggles, such as an embargo, or a lawsuit, or a game of chess. Meanwhile, naturally occurring events, such as a pandemic, could produce losses that are similar to those we're going to discuss today, but they're really outside of what we're trying to directly focus on. So limiting the context to adversarial clashes between two opponents is helpful. Hopefully, this definition makes it clear that we're talking about actual amounts, not percentages or proportional losses, which would not produce the results we're addressing today. Also, the term fighting power may sound a bit artificial, but again, such a term is general enough to include not only overtly war-making assets like swords and tanks, but also supplies like food and fuel, and can even accommodate different contexts altogether, such as funds to sustain a lawsuit or an embargo, or pieces in games like chess, or players in games like football. Finally, I've gone with the term loss swap rather than simply swap because prisoner exchanges are sometimes called prisoner swaps. And prisoner exchanges do not function in the same way as the loss swap we're examining. So with those definitional matters clarified, let's move forward into discussion of an example scenario that we will use to illustrate the math of war function being extracted today. By the way, definitions like this one can usually be improved over time, and I always view scholarly material as provisional works in progress. So if you can see ways to improve this definition, please feel free to leave your proposed changes in the comments to this video, and I'll be sure to include the amended and improved language in future discussions if warranted. Our illustrative scenario today poses a battle between two groups of fantasy beings, elves and orcs. The assumption underlying this discussion is that each elf and each orc is an equivalent fighting power unit per our definition. Thus, for instance, each orc and each elf are of equivalent strength in terms of offensive capability, defensive capability, mobility, and so on. At the beginning of the hypothetical contest, 12 elves are facing 9 orcs. While not insurmountable, this numerical difference definitely makes an uphill battle for the orcs. Imagine, for instance, a football team that had 11 players on the field opposing a football team that only had 8 players on the field. The latter side would be, of course, extremely hard-pressed to compete, since, for instance, 3 players would probably be left unguarded or unblocked at any given time. The ratio of elves to orcs in this scenario currently reduces to 4-3, demonstrably a clear advantage for the elves. However, keep in mind that such a ratio still gives the orcs a fighting chance. For instance, we can imagine a situation in which 4 elves were facing 3 orcs, and by sheer good luck, from the orcs' point of view, one of the elves slipped and fell and was knocked out of combat at the very beginning of the encounter. That stroke of luck would leave 3 remaining elves facing 3 orcs, numerical parity, or 1-to-1 odds. So at this point, it's certainly not hopeless for the orcs. If we suppose that after a first round of fighting, the elves have lost 3 members, and the orcs have also lost 3 members, we have what is called in the present video a loss swap. Both sides have lost an equivalent amount of fighting power. The resulting ratio is 3-2 in favor of the elves, which is even more lopsided than the original ratio of 4-3. If a second round of fighting produces an identical loss swap of 3 members on each side, 6 remaining elves are facing 3 remaining orcs, a ratio of 2-to-1. All else being equal, 2-to-1 odds are going to be very hard for the orcs to overcome. In other contexts, such as a decision-making body, a 2-to-1 ratio is what might be called a supermajority, a threshold that indicates a high level of confidence. So the odds continue to get worse for the orcs. Let's say a third round of fighting results in a loss swap of 2 members to each side. That leaves 4 elves against 1 orc still standing. A ratio of 4-to-1 would be traditionally considered an overwhelming force, where, all else being equal, the outcome of the battle is in little doubt. Now you might think, but what if that remaining orc is a sort of Superman-like super orc? That would certainly have the potential to change the outcome of the battle, but it would violate the conditions established at the beginning of our conversation, namely, that the elves and orcs are all of equal fighting power. Thus, the remaining orc possesses no special skills and no special powers that the remaining 4 elves don't each possess individually as well. So, compare the ratio we've finished with after 3 rounds of fighting, 4-to-1, to the ratio we started with, 4-to-3. Obviously, the ending ratio is much worse for the orcs than the beginning ratio. Yet this result has been produced through 3 rounds of fighting that each caused numerically equivalent losses on both sides. Numerically speaking, the elves did not get the better of the orcs in any of these rounds of fighting, and yet at the end of the 3 rounds, the sole remaining orc has very little chance of surviving another round and is outnumbered 4-to-1. What can we take away from this example? As you know from previous videos, the goal of the Math of War series is to equip ourselves with decision-making tools or mental machines that can easily handle certain tasks for us, so that we can then free up our mental resources, energy, and time and apply them to improving the speed, quality, and shareability of our decisions and our decision-making process. The tool or mental machine we've learned today is that a loss swap favors the stronger side. And as always in the Math of War series, you don't need to take my word for it. You don't need to appeal to any other authority, be that Napoleon or Hannibal or whoever your favorite commander happens to be. You can simply re-examine the math we discussed today, or you can create your own scenarios and rederive the same principle without reliance upon anyone else's experience or opinion. I'll generally save most commentary for future videos, but we'll here briefly draw out a couple of implications of the loss swap function we learned today. The stronger side will generally not have an incentive to avoid or refuse a fair fight. By a fair fight, I mean a sort of pitched battle where there are no clear situational advantages on either side, just 2 forces lining up on a big flat field and charging at each other, for instance. Such a fair fight, as we can see by using the mental machine we learned today, would work to the benefit of the stronger side. Obviously, the stronger side would prefer to have a situational advantage if they can find it, but they don't need such an advantage in order to make progress toward victory. And indeed, the longer they wait for an engagement, the greater the risk that some unforeseen event will come along to rescue the weaker side, such as a natural disaster or the entrance of a new ally on the weaker side. So, the general tendency on the stronger side will be to prefer bringing about an engagement the sooner the better, and not to wait for a situational advantage to materialize. The weaker side, meanwhile, has opposite incentives. They will know that a fair fight ultimately works to their disadvantage, and the greater the discrepancy between their power and the power of the stronger side, the more undesirable, from their point of view, a fair fight will be. Their incentive is therefore to maneuver, manipulate, hide, run, deceive, and delay as long as they can until they achieve some sort of at least temporary situational advantage. And then, only then, would they choose to engage in combat. This situational advantage could come along, for instance, as a result of a dumb decision by the stronger side, or by careful maneuvering by the weaker side, or by some unforeseeable natural event such as a hurricane or a flood. But whatever the case, the weaker side's general tendency will be toward avoiding engagement and delaying as long as possible in hopes of a perfect opportunity materializing. This one principle that we have discussed today, that a loss swap favors the stronger side, drives a large part of the choices that adversaries make today, be they governmental entities, breakaway factions, business corporations, or law firms, or contestants in some game tournament, and that they have made throughout history. I hope you've enjoyed our conversation today, and we'll look forward to your comments, criticisms, and suggestions in the comment section below this video.